So, as Brad said, I am a UX designer for IBM Accessibility. And what we do on that team is we work to make tools that make it easier for technology teams to apply accessibility best practices. Because we recognize that there is kind of a big learning curve. But what I'm going to be talking today about is kind of just the general thought process behind inclusive design and how you can work to be an advocate for both people with disabilities and for, and since I'm a designer, I'm coming from a design standpoint, but I think that you'll find that a lot of the stuff that we'll be going over is pretty universal in terms of how to be inclusive. So a little bit about me, I went to NCSU for grad school, and that's really, even so, oh, excuse me, let me back up a little bit. I'm also profoundly deaf, and I have bilateral cochlear implants. So this is obviously an area where I have a lot of personal vested interest in, but it really wasn't until I went to grad school where I was like, oh, design for disability doesn't need to be terrible, even though I've been exposed to it my whole life. I was like, it could be actually cool. And it's really an exciting time to be in this space and thinking about inclusiveness. So I actually did my thesis project on a user interface for cochlear implants because I was kind of astonished by how little UX thought went into my own devices, and it kind of just blew open the whole space for me. So I'm also the director of inclusive design for AIGA Raleigh, which is the local chapter, and AIGA is the National Graphic Design Association, if you're not familiar with it. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else I'm missing, probably, but I'll catch up on that. So I'll just go into it right away. So there are these different terms that are kind of used interchangeably, but there are subtle differences with what these terms are. They're all like buzz terms. So we have universal design, which is kind of the older term for inclusive design, but the difference is that the connotation is that there's one design that works for everybody. And I will go into that more, but I find that term a little bit problematic. And actually, it's fun trivia is that it was coined by an architect who was at North Carolina State University. So that just happened, that was just a coincidence, but I thought that was cool. So that's the concept, is that it's just one design for every need possible, which is a tall order, basically. Accessible design is just an attribute of inclusive design or universal design. You're working to make these things accessible. So that's what the difference there. And then inclusive design is a methodology. So it's how it's what I'll be kind of walking you through a little bit today. So how do you apply inclusive design? You're recognizing that the world is not designed with everyone in mind. And one of the great trends that have happened is that the realization that people are not the problem is how things are designed. So, or created or made, or, who's involved in that process. So, and this is what, the next slide, or examine this more, but it's just brief. And this really was what opened it up for me, because as a person with a disability, I thought, well, I don't fit in. But if you think in terms of, if you take that onus off of you and you place it around the surroundings, it's liberating in many ways. And it really helps designers reframe things and anybody looking to be inclusive and accessible. So this, as I said, this has been kind of a slow progression, but we're seeing it even in language being used in official documents. So like in the 80s, the World Health Organization described, defined disability as in the context of health experience, a disability is any restriction or lack of ability resulting from an impairment to perform an activity in the manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. There are so many red flags in this. You can't say half of this stuff anymore. First of all, impairment is considered kind of, a lot of people, a lot of different types of disabilities don't like to be called impaired because it's saying this person is impaired as opposed to the world didn't think about this person. Also, the idea of normal, and this is kind of going into disability studies a little bit, but what is normal? Who is normal? Like normal doesn't exist, basically. But now it was redefined in 2019 as context dependent. So the new definition is disability is not just a health problem. It's a complex phenomenon reflecting the interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which he or she lives. So that really just kind of brings it home in the fact that, people with diverse abilities it's not their fault. It's really the fault of the surroundings, which is so true. And framing it in this way makes it easier to cater to people with many different disabilities and experiences. So one of the things that I find that in my term, so I was in grad school in 2017, so that's really when I entered this space. It's amazing to learn how rapidly it keeps changing. So, but language now, and I gave a presentation similar to this one a year and a half ago, and I've had to make adjustments. That's how quickly things are constantly changing. So there's this thing called person-first language, which means that you say a person with a disability, a person who is a wheelchair user, a person who is kind of putting the person in front, is putting the personality in the person before their disability rather than saying a deaf person, a blind person. So, but a lot of groups of disabilities are trying to reclaim that word. So the deaf community, people of the deaf community, by and large, and this is not, there are always exceptions, but they prefer to be called a deaf person. So, but basically, so these are different terms for, the different types of disabilities. There's blind and low vision, so BLV. Sometimes it's called BVI, which is blind and visually impaired. But again, the impairedness is not always copacetic. So, but basically, at the end of the day, if you meet somebody who has a disability, ask them what they want to be called or what their comfort is. And you're not going to offend them. Because almost, for the most part, obviously, not everybody's the same, but we actually, at least I'm speaking for myself, I prefer when people come to me and ask questions because there's a sincere, I want people to learn because, there's so much taboo around it that the only way that we can progress is if we talk about it and are open about it. So that's, and an important thing to say here, a person with a wheelchair or wheelchair user, you never want to say wheelchair bound because wheelchairs are an amazing assistive technology device, not technology, it's a device that helps people move. So it's actually liberating. It's not something to be bound to. So it's just, and the reason I'm trying to give you this, this isn't about the design, but it's giving you the tools to be able to talk about it comfortably and not feel afraid to help, because I do feel that is like a barrier that many people face. So This is the persona spectrum, which is taken from the work of the Microsoft Design. They have a graph on this, so I'm kind of pointing this out. One thing is that when you design something or you aim something to a person with a disability, and I'm thinking in terms of design, there's so many, you're not just helping a person who, so for example, so there's permanent disability, there's temporary disability, and there's situational disability. So for example, mobility, you can have somebody who was born with one arm or lost an arm, that is a permanent disability. Or your design could help somebody who has an arm injury. And then this one, I relate to this a lot, but if the situational disability could be a new parent who's constantly holding a baby and only has one arm free. So if you design, I don't know, a person that only has one hand available to them, these are this is a spectrum in which your design could help who you'll be helping. And so there are many different, so this is for sight, either you're blind or you have cataracts and you haven't had cataract surgery, or you're a distracted driver. Hearing, either you're deaf, or maybe you have an ear infection, you can't hear well, or you're a bartender in a very loud space. So the reason I thought that it would be good to show this is that there's such a wide spectrum that your solution or message may be targeted towards not just people with disabilities. So this is kind of a fighting point. Like if you need to argue why designing for inclusion is important, you can say these are all the types of people that you may be benefiting. So like before, I was talking about how universal design is one design for all. It sounds great. It sounds like puppies and rainbows, and that's what we want. However, in reality, it's not feasible. I mean, you can't expect, one raincoat to suit everybody. If you have one person who's 5'2" and another person who's 6'2", that raincoat is probably not going to be. So one thing that we talk a lot about is customizability and modality. And I'll get more into this later, but and there's a great quote that's coming up. I'll save that for that, but it's just very difficult, and I'll explain why. So we have the spectrum within a disability, right? So I talked about like how being inclusive can help not just people with permanent disabilities, but even within like a permanent disability, you are working with a group of people who experience that disability incredibly differently. So because I'm deaf and I know the deaf community and the hard of hearing community and understand us better, I'm kind of pointing to, but you can kind of say this for any type of disability. So within the deaf space, you have, a different identity. So deaf with a capital D means you are part of the deaf community and you use sign language. You may be a verbal communicator, but that's not your primary language. Your primary language is sign language, and you're deeply embedded in the deaf community. Or you have deaf with a lowercase d. This is people who are deaf, but medically deaf, but are verbal communicators. I fall under this category of deaf. They're not part of the community. So the difference is that you're culturally deaf, which is capital D, and capital D also refers to the language and all of the rich cultural aspects of a community. That's what that represents. And then hard of hearing, generally, there's a spectrum of hearing loss. So, people who can hear a little bit with hearing aids, or just a little bit, more, even without aids, can still be considered hard of hearing. Technically, because I speak, I should be considered hard of hearing, but medically, I'm profoundly deaf, so I identify as deaf with a lowercase d. So then those hearing assistants, these are all the different types of, levels of assistance. So either maybe they wear hearing aids, maybe we don't, maybe we have cochlear implants. So that's kind of just showing. And so you can have people who are deaf who don't hear at all. And then you can have people who have assistance and can hear with help and need other types of assistance. So that's kind of a broad range there. And then your levels of communication. So that, these are all the others. And then there's other factors too, like whether it's a big difference for a person to have been born deaf versus somebody who is deaf later in life, because if you've acquired language at, at the appropriate age, it's very different than if you had to learn how to speak as a deaf person. So that's a very big different thing. And then the support level, ongoing health issues, because many people who are deaf also have other disabilities, or or it's not always. Don't assume that one person who has one disability doesn't have others. And the levels of education. So because I like to make everything about me, this is me as a persona. So I am deaf with a lowercase d. I use cochlear implants, and I'm a verbal communicator, but I also rely heavily on lip reading. I'm late deafened. I have high levels of support, and I don't have other ongoing health issues. And I have up to a master's degree. So if you are trying to design something or target something towards me, you might not, it might not be the same solution for someone who uses sign language or ASL. For example, like a lot of times if I go to an event, I will ask for the ADA area, and they'll have a sign language interpreter, but that's not useful for me, but it's useful for somebody who's sign. So, so that there's just a huge spectrum within a disability too. So, so this is the quote I wanted to kind of point out. So inclusive design doesn't mean you're designing one thing for all people. You're designing a diversity of ways to participate so that everyone has a sense of belonging. And I think this is really great. This is kind of like really what brings the message that people just want to be included, be given a way to participate. And that's the important part. And Susan Grossman, you should look her up. She's great. She has written lots of great things about concepts around disability and inclusive design. So key elements, so let me see. So as I said before, you're not trying to create one thing for all people. You're trying to create many things. And in the age of technology, that is becoming easier and easier because you can target certain things to one people. You can offer, multiple ways of experiencing the same thing, especially in a virtual space. But there's so many different ways. I've worked with like the Museum of Natural Science here in Raleigh, and they're doing incredible stuff to make sure that their physical spaces are accessible and that the information is accessible. So for people who are neurodiverse, and I didn't have that on the slide before, excuse me, but neurodiverse people are people with like autism, different levels of cognitive disabilities, and so they have like a quiet room for people to go off and just kind of compose themselves, and there's like warnings if there's anything flashing. So you can do this in a physical form or in a virtual way. So you want to try and offer more than one way to experience your designs. You want to allow people to set their preferences, and because of the age that we're in, we want to allow for new ideas and new technologies to be added. So it's just rapidly morphing, rapidly changing. And that's something that if you're interested in the space, just to keep in mind, because as I said, I gave this talk like a year and a half ago, and I've had to change so many things just because to keep up with what's being said. One thing, so this is just me talking as my soapbox. One thing that if you have something that is specifically targeted towards people with disabilities, I would argue to include users from the beginning. And that's not just for people with disabilities, that's with anything. If you are looking to include, to design something or create something or market something towards, a disenfranchised group, or, and you are not, you don't be, you will eliminate so many mistakes if you do that, because there is no replacement for first person experience. There's a lot of talk of empathy, that's another buzzword. And empathy is great, but it's usually when you're in the new frontier, I feel like we haven't gotten to the point where empathy is enough. So empathy right now is not enough. Go to the source. And it's across the board. If you are designing something and you want to reach, the African American community, be sure to include people, from the African American community to deliver that message. For persons with disabilities, and that's PWDs, listen to us, talk to us, hire us. That'll be a huge step going forward. So how do we apply inclusive design? Include users early and often. Start your design process knowing who they are. So like that that I showed you, if you know you want to include this person and this person, really just start. The idea is start with one group, make it a great design, and then go to the next group, make that a great design. The problem with design is that are going to, suddenly disinvite other groups of people. So if you can make a great design that works for a blind person, then work on that, don't compromise on that, and then focus on a design for, a deaf person who, and then offer both of those experiences. Don't try to mash them together because, verbal audio description is going to be completely useless for me, so like certain things like that. So if you focus, just be hyper specific in your message, in your design, and then start to bring in other experiences. Allow your users to become co-designers whenever possible. Refer to standards, and I'm talking about WCAG, I'm talking about all of the, the ADA standards, but recognize that they're constantly changing and that they might not be up to speed yet. It takes time for things to be amended, it takes time. So use your own best, guidance, use your own best, don't just rely on that and say, okay, I'm done. Like it might not be up to snuff, basically. And then, this is more just general stuff, but to give you the tools of being able to talk to people with disabilities, being able to interact with people, and speak about them. These are just some general etiquette, a lot, and this is just also what I've experienced too, don't focus on disability stuff all the time. We are more than our disabilities. And this is very general. This isn't in terms of design, but if you are going to, for example, hire somebody with a disability and, you want to be inclusive and you want to interact with them, these are some of the things that we like to avoid. Talk directly to them. Don't, a lot of times people will talk to my husband rather than me, and it's like, hi, hello, so, and offer, if you're trying to be helpful, don't assume, and ask first. So you see somebody with a wheelchair, don't automatically think it's okay to just take the wheelchair and help them. Ask them, that seems totally basic, but you'd be surprised. And then when in doubt, ask what to do. and then listen to them. That's really the main message here. So this is also from disability studies, but like avoid stereotypes. You know, there's a tendency in Hollywood to kind of depict people with disabilities, and I think that pop culture is a very influential body. So just so you're aware, you know, either people with disabilities are usually described as victims or heroes or the villain. You know, we have Scar from The Lion King. We have, you know, these heartwarming stories where, you know, the person with the disability is just so heartwarming. And, you know, well, we have supernatural powers in place of our disability, which is silly. I don't have any other, you know, my other senses are not heightened, which is kind of a misconception. We're imperfect people, just like everyone else. You know, we also have bad and running breath and all of that. So, you know, don't make any, you know, the more human you treat us, the better. So this is, you can just screenshot these. Like I won't go too much. I don't know how we are on time. Oh God. So this is for people who are DHS, which is deaf and hard of hearing. So as I said before, people who have hearing loss but communicate verbally are technically hard of hearing, and people who are profoundly deaf are either deaf with a capital D or deaf with a lowercase d. So I talk verbally, but if I want to communicate with sign language, you are talking to me, don't talk to my interpreter, still talk to the deaf person, you know, that does take a little bit of practice, because it's, you know, you're hearing from the interpreter, you know, who's translating what you're saying with sign language, but still, you know, we still want to feel connected to you in any space. So in times of COVID, which has been really a doozy for deaf people, because for example, I rely so much on lip reading, which is why I have a cart transcriber on video calls, because, you know, the video quality might not translate so well. So anyway, wearing masks has been terrible, because I can't go out and speak to people, you know, I can't hear people who wear masks. So don't cover your lips. If you happen to come across a person who's deaf, and you have to wear a mask, because that's the responsible thing to do, you know, be prepared to maybe write out stuff or use your phone to communicate. That's good. So we're constantly having to adapt to new situations. And things that might be helpful for an audience who is deaf or hard of hearing: closed captioning for movies and videos, flashing lights. This is an example of something that's helpful for someone who's deaf, but maybe not someone who's neurodiverse, somebody who has autism. Flashing lights are a big no-no for people with autism, but are actually super helpful for people like me. So like I have a strobe alarm to wake up in the morning. So just another example. And transcript and closed services. So that's what I have today. If you're not following along now, it's actually kind of cool to see. Etiquette for people who are wheelchair users. Personal space, you know, you should really consider the wheelchair to be a part of the person's body. Like if you wouldn't go up to someone and hold their arm, don't go up to someone and grab their wheelchair. Like, it's, you know, that's important. And also the service dogs. If you have, if there's a service animal, don't touch them without permission either. A lot of times with service animals, they have off times, and, you know, they're on duty X times, and, you know, you just don't know. So just ask, or just assume not to touch them. Place items within reach, make eye contact, you know, that just goes against, you know, basic human connection. We all crave that, we all want that. So eye contact is great. And things that might be helpful: accessible parking, elevators, ramps, and wide hallways. So that's something to keep in mind. Like if you're having an event, these are things that you can refer to. Etiquette for people who are blind and low vision. Again, and I learned the most because I worked on a project where we were making astronomy software accessible to people who are blind and low vision. And this was a completely, I personally, because we have so many things that our technologies to assist us are kind of the opposite. I was kind of like afraid to kind of even just be in the same room because I rely so much on lip reading, and they tend, people who don't, that's not something that blind people do. So this was all super helpful for me to know, which is it's okay to offer help, but don't never take without asking. This was something, and I should have done this at the beginning of this call, but announce things that are visual. So if you are about to leave the room, this happened way too many times, but I would just leave a room and the person that I was talking to had no idea that I had left the room, and they're like, hello. So that's something, just be like, okay, I am leaving the room. Also on Zoom calls, I should have done this at the beginning of the call, but if you you're going to be speaking with people, and this is helpful for anybody. You can describe yourself. So I am a white woman with dark hair and a dark shirt in a room, in a studio. And so like describing visual cues like that is very helpful. And again, don't assume anything. Not every blind person knows Braille. There are so many different types of visual impairments and visual disabilities that you don't even know. Some people, it's very helpful to have high contrast, very large. Some people have a type of disability that's kind of like a pinhole. So they need things to be really small so that it can fit within the range of vision. And there's some really cool things. So like the use of technology is incredibly diverse. So there are like keyboards that like pop up Braille. So it's reading the screen, and it has Braille that kind of pops up through these metal things. It's super cool to see. But not everybody has the means for that. Not everybody can read Braille. So make no assumption. And things that can be helpful, tactile surfaces. So like 3D printing has become amazing for them, because we've been able to kind of describe things in a more tactile way. Voiceover screen readers, that's what reads the screen as you're like on a website. It will read out everything to the user. A voiceover is the Apple equivalent. A screen reader is a general. And high contrast is generally something that you want to offer in any technical space. There's so much, I'm being so broad here, but there's so many details, and I have resources for you if you want to know more about those specific details. So like I said, don't be afraid to, be like, I'm going to tackle inclusive design. Everybody's making mistakes because there's so much that's unknown. There's so many things that are changing. I'm sure I have made 100 mistakes just now in this talk. So it's part of the process, and as long as you are open and willing to understand that you may have made a mistake, you may have made a blunder, say what's the right thing to do and move forward, applying, trying your best to apply that new knowledge that you have. And I think that that's kind of, just in the space that we're in today in 2020, I think that this is a really good lesson for everybody. If you ever need to make the argument why do you want to apply inclusive design, here's just specific design stuff that were initially designed for like a person with a disability, but have ended up being helpful to all of us in so many cool ways. So long playing records were initially designed to be talking books. Ballpoint pens even were something that were designed for people who were not able to write very well. So anybody with, like rheumatoid arthritis, for example. Remote controls is something that was designed for people with mobility issues. Again, so tape, multi-track tape recorders, again, for audiobooks. Oh, this one's my favorite. So typewriters, it was actually invented for a blind Italian countess. So she didn't have any way to write because she was visually, she was blind. So, but she could remember where her fingers would go to type out something. So that's really cool. So basically the keyboard is the result of, designing something specific for a person with a disability. Automatic captioning, predictive text correcting. So there's just a lot of, and even text messaging, early forms of text messaging were developed for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. So, if you ever need to make a use case for why it is profitable to design for people with disabilities, this is something you can say, when you design one thing for one person, there's so many unintended beneficiaries. So that's that. So here are some resources for you. I am playing favoritism. This is the team that I work on at IBM. We have an amazing, we just released this in September, and it is like a huge resource for tech teams looking to apply accessibility from the planning stages to the offering managers. It's really great. I highly recommend it. So if you are looking to see how can your tech team apply accessibility, this is how it is, and it's split it up by role. So if you're a developer, it gives you a set, if you're a designer, it tells you what to do. And if you are like a manager, just being like, okay, I know I have to do X, Y, and Z. How do I make sure that everybody's pulling their weight and being accessible? And, for tech teams, like people, teams at IBM, and, we have to think about that because we have so many government clients, so it has to be accessible. So that's a really great resource. Then it like covers a lot of the material as far as like what the proper language is, and it's great because it's constantly updating. So you can go to these websites to see what, this is actually a journalism website that talks about, what is the proper language around disability. And again, I'll share this with you so you have it. Also, Microsoft has been great in this space. They have a really great book that they put out. I think I have it here. So and this is basically available online as well. And it really talks about just the thought around what it means to be inclusive. And it's really, I find that it's very universal in terms of applying it to different fields and different spaces. And then this is actually, I really preach that whole include the user thing, concept, because it's from a book called Alan Newell, who was a professor at the University of Dundee in Scotland. He developed this concept of user-centered inclusive design, which is basically bringing the user into your process at the beginning, because if you try to retroactively make something inclusive, it's going to be a mess, because not only do you're ruining a great experience for people who are able, because all of a sudden you're compromising and being like, oh shoot, we need to make it accessible for people who are blind. Let's add high contrast, and it's gonna ruin it for everybody basically. So have really split up who your audience is, and then try to accommodate each of those by offering different experiences. So this is and it's on Google Books, so it's free. You can just look at it. It's really good. He actually did it in terms of like the aging population and including, people who, this is the other thought process, is that if you live long enough, we're all going to become disabled, because, as you get older, you lose your faculties a little bit. So that's a really great resource, and I found it doing my thesis.